Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
All right, greetings everyone, and welcome back to another exciting episode of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Daniel Lowry, and in today's episode, it is all about our A+ series. That's right, get your mind wrapped around the software side of things so that we can become a wonderful technician out there, having a lot of fun and making a little money maybe even. And joining us in the studio to help us in that endeavor, our good friend, Mr. Wes Bryan. Wes, welcome back, man. We're glad to have you, and how's it going?
Oh, man, it's going great. Great to be here. And you know what's interesting is we started off in this 902 series with the features of Windows. And one thing that we didn't start off was, how the heck do you get Windows on your machine? So I think we might have
you grab a Linux disk and you slap it in.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's actually what I call a Windows repair disk. It's a Linux Live CD, but we won't go there right now. That's right. So we're going to look at how we actually get the operating system on your machine, because, and again, in a previous episode we talked a lot about the features, and there were quite a few of them. But one of the things that we didn't really discuss is how to get those features up and running when you are going to use the operating system. So in this one, we're going to be looking really at how to install the operating system, and we have quite a few choices. We have some choices that are beneficial in the home environment. We have some choices that are maybe not so beneficial in a corporate environment, but maybe a little bit more beneficial inside of a corporate environment as well. So what are the options that you have, and where might you see some of these options? And that is what we are going to discuss here in this episode. So let's go ahead and dive in. If you're following along at home, like Dan says, the 220-902 exam, this is going to be given a scenario: install Windows PC operating systems using the appropriate methods. So how do we know what the appropriate methods are if we don't first know those methods? So that's where we're going to start. Well, let's look at the boot methods that we have. All right. So what are the basics? When we talk about boot method, what do we mean? Well, if you remember when we were talking about BIOS back in the hardware episodes that we were doing inside of the 220-901, the very first exam that you'll take with A+, we talked about the BIOS, right? We talked about CMOS. We talked about the fact that the BIOS allows the hardware to be brought online. A quick test, a self-diagnostic test called POST, right? Power on self-test. And then the BIOS starts to fire off signals that brings the hardware online, gives it electrical current, stabilizes it, such as the power, if you will, RAM, video, all of this. The last thing the BIOS does is it looks for something known as a boot code. All right, now the boot code is basically what allows the operating system essentially to take over the hardware. See, BIOS, when it first comes online, it basically brings the hardware online, and then it's going to hand over control to an operating system that's going to bootstrap, and then again pass that control off to the operating system. So when we talk about boot method, where does the BIOS or UEFI, I kind of use that term generically, but we have to be a little bit more technical when we talk about the A+ exam, because it is a professional level technical exam. So whether it's basic input-output system or the next generation firmware platform called Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, each one has to look for the boot code, the master boot code. That's where the boot methods come in. All right, so some boot methods are a single one-time location. And what I mean by that is the BIOS or the UEFI finds that boot code in that one location, and then the next time we reboot the computer, it doesn't find it in that location. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean here coming up. Other times you'll find that the boot code is found in the same location every time you press power on the machine. All right, so what are we talking about? All right, so those single or one-time locations, you might hear it configured in the BIOS as a one-time boot menu. And why might we do that? Well, first of all, when you don't have an operating system on the hard drive, there's no way that the BIOS can look to the hard drive for something that doesn't exist yet. It hasn't been written to the hard drive. So what we can do is we can use, in the older days, you could use a CD-ROM for something like Windows. Today, you're not going to fit Windows on a CD-ROM. It's got a lot of bloat in it. It's a really big operating system today. Now, you can still use CD for things like Linux distros, because Linux distros are very, very streamlined. In fact, you'll find a lot of people that when they prefer Linux, they prefer to have the minimum on that, and I'll get into what the format of an ISO is here in a second, but on that disk, the minimum that you need to get the operating system installed, and then they tailor make it and customize it to suit their needs or whatever the purpose is. Windows, on the other hand, and including things like Ubuntu, if you will, I guess you could say Ubuntu is also a fairly big operating system, doesn't fit on a CD. All right, so you also have to use, well, the other alternative, right? And the other alternative is a DVD. In fact, I got a little diagram here, basic diagram on my computer, just to kind of show you why we would be limited over why would we use CD over DVD? Well, I want you to think about the capacity of the optical media. And again, we're not going to go back into the hardware. Dan and I cover that in 901 pretty extensively. But remember, there is a limitation to the size of a CD, which means you can't get Windows on a CD anymore.
Yeah, it looks like the CDs really are horrible at storage there. 720 kilobytes.
Yeah, exactly.
Or is it megabytes?
It was supposed to be megabytes, yeah.
That's why I was cracking a joke.
That is a step back to
horrible.
step back to 1985. Yeah, that's right. So bad that, yeah, no wonder. It takes 15 CDs to get 1 meg on there.
Exactly.
That's right. Good catch, too, Dan. I'm glad you, that's why I got him here, man. So megabytes, right? So 720 megabyte limitation on those CDs. And because of that, well, you'll notice that the operating system on Windows today is, I want to say it's approaching 3 gigs if it isn't already there now. All right. And what do I mean by 3 gigs? What am I talking about? Well, I also want to talk about the DVD real quick, and we need to just briefly talk about a format that I want you to be aware of too. And that's why you can see today, if you do have installation media at all, and we'll get into that, you're going to see that Windows has to come on a DVD. All right, and that's because a DVD, it isn't limited in its capacity, at least at this point in time, in this point in history, as of 2017, because when you look at Windows being potential of 3 gigs and higher, it'll still fit on a DVD at 4.7 gigs just on a single side, and you don't really need this much, but you could have a dual-sided DVD that would have 9.4 gigabytes in capacity. All right. Now, the other thing I want you to keep in mind is that when you do a one-time boot, all right, what are you doing off the optical media? Well, what you're telling in the BIOS is that on that optical media is a boot code that allows you to essentially bootstrap an operating system. All right. Now, I want to talk about the file that would be located, all right? And I know I'm kind of jumping out of order here on my notes, Dan, but in one of the things that we have in the notes is something known as an ISO file. An ISO file essentially is nothing more than a container, but it's a container that's kind of interesting, a container that holds all the parts that's necessary to install an operating system. I want you to think about something. If you went out to a store right now and you bought a dresser, and all the assembly was required on your part, well, what do you have? You essentially have a box with a bunch of pieces in it, right? You have to bring that box home, and you take the dresser out, and you hopefully can read instructions. I can't do that too well. And you can put it together, and you build, because it has all the pieces in it, including the instructions on how to put that dresser together. Well, that's essentially what an ISO is. An ISO actually isn't really an operating system. It's a container that contains all the pieces you need to install the operating system and get it running. And that's what's on this optical media, as well as USB. Let me go ahead and throw USB in here in the mix too, because what you can do is use flash media, and you put the ISO file, if you will, on the USB media. All right, so that's one of the things to keep in mind. Now, I do want you to understand that these are forms of one-time boot options, right? Another form of one-time boot options, what's known as a repair installation. And a repair installation is when you boot into the Windows recovery environment and you have some kind of functionality problem that, error or something that's going on an already installed operating system, and what do? Well, you do the same thing. You boot to the optical media or a USB drive in this case, and what happens is it loads a very, very small minimalistic form of Windows, and that Windows operating system allows you access to the hard drive to try to repair it, all right? Now, you also have other kinds of single or one-time boot locations when it comes to boot methods, too. We have what's known as Pixie Boot, all right? And that is the pre-boot execution environment. We'll get a little bit more into that, but just know for now that that's a way that the operating or your network adapter can call out to the network, and it can essentially say, hey, is there an operating system out there? You also have what's known as NetBoot too. NetBoot, again, a way to boot off of the network card. All right. Now, you also have continuous boot locations. All right. When we talk about continuous boot locations, it means that I don't have to put an optical drive in the optical, or an optical disc in the optical drive. I don't have to plug in a USB drive. I don't have to press a keyboard shortcut to tell the BIOS, hey, boot to the network, right? Some examples of that are your internal hard drive. Once you already have your operating system installed, it puts the boot code in a sector of the hard drive that it tells the BIOS and the UEFI system every time that's where you go. Right? You have other examples of continuous boot locations when you're doing multi-boot. All right? When I have two different operating systems installed on the same hard drive. Or really, today it could be across multiple hard drives, really. But you're telling it, I want to boot to this operating system once, shut the machine down, guess what? I can point it to the next operating system, but it is continuous location. Some other examples too, and this happens more in corporate environments than it does most really in home environments. You have external drives as well, all right, or hot swappable drives. And that's where you actually do a combination of the pre-boot execution environment. You call out to the network and you say, hey, I need an operating system, and it basically goes over the network and pulls that operating system down off a network-attached storage device or a storage area network, right, a SAN. Again, these are external drives, right? These are hot swappable drives, and they're hot swappable in the fact that if one of them fails, we can replace them, right, like we've talked about in the hardware section. All right, so those are a couple of different locations, right? We do this in things like servers and thin clients, and like I said, that continuous location like that in external drives a lot of times is done inside of a corporate environment. Now, I do want you to keep in mind, because we've mentioned CD-ROM, all right? We've mentioned DVD. One of the things that I want you to keep in mind is that with both of these locations, right, essentially you need local access. If I'm going to use these as boot methods, I have to have physical access to the machine. Why is that? Well, I want you to think about it. When I put a disk in the optical drive and I push power, I have to tell the BIOS, either through a configuration in the BIOS or by a keyboard shortcut, to look to that location to install the operating system. All right, so it does require local access. Same thing with a USB device too. Now you might say, well, wait, Wes, you could just put the optical drive in it and walk away, right, and boot the machine up from a remote installation source. And I guess technically you could. But again, at some point you need physical access to the machine. All right. Now, one of the benefits, if you will, of USB, right? You can use the speed of flash media, and that is a good thing, right? Because you have an optical disc that is spinning. It's going to take, it's a mechanical disc. You're going to have some kind of limitation on the RPMs, that the speed that the device can move. So you could, again, use USB. Keep in mind that all three of these methods are what are known as a decentralized model. And what do we mean by that? Well, I want you to think of networking. In a home environment where you only have a couple of computers, or even a small office, home office, where you only have a couple of computers, it's not too bad, right? I can go to one machine, I can start to install the operating system. Chances are I can just turn around and go to the next machine and I can install it, all right? Now, I picked on Dan throughout this whole entire series because I know he worked for a company that was very large, hundreds of locations and thousands of devices. Dan, would you want to do optical media or USB installation across all those thousands of devices?
Oh, heck no. I mean, you'd quit. It'd be too difficult. I've done it, right? We've had to do a couple of optical installations, but that is not the standard format to getting stuff. It's inefficient for a company of that size. It just would not work out. By the time you got done getting everybody installed, the new operating system be out, and you'd be doing it all over again. I mean, I guess it's job security.
Yeah, if you're getting paid by the hour, it's fine,
yeah.
right?
Might as well, right?
It's kind of like mowing 1,000 acres with a push mower. By the time you're done, you have to start back over again. Right. So again, you can see that a decentralized model, that isn't really too good when you talk about inside of corporate environments. Now, we'll get to some things that are a little bit better in a corporate environment, but just understand, when we're talking about those local installation sources like optical media, and like USB media, that is really just going to be for the home environment. It's good for the tech bench when you work at a local tech, tech company where the people are just bringing in, a computer randomly and says, hey, I need to reinstall the operating system, or you decide, through being the tech, that you have to reinstall it. Now, I do kind of want to mention another concept that I want you to be aware of too. When it comes to booting your operating system, you have two different forms of, when we say temporary, and we can say permanent, right? All right, I got a little diagram here, and I want to talk about this concept too. All right, and it's important. It's one of the concepts that I remember as I was becoming an A+ technician and I was studying for A+. It was some of the sources that I had that didn't really talk about it too much. So I remember the first time I heard about a Linux Live CD, I was just starstruck. What do you mean? Then when I heard about WinPE, the pre-installation environment, or Windows recovery environment, I'm like, what are you talking about? Your operating system is running in RAM. And that's before I actually understood that, well, pretty much every operating system runs in RAM. It just depends on if it's stored on the hard drive or not. So we have what's known as local installation, all right? When we talk about local installation, keep in mind we're talking about installed on the local storage, right? All right, typically your hard drives or your solid state drives, but these are your internal drives, right? However, we do have memory resident operating systems like a Linux Live CD or like a Windows PE disk, which pre-installation environment, still Windows, but it only sits in RAM. It doesn't install itself to the hard drive. Linux Live CDs give you the benefit, and I know we're in a Windows section here, but I really want you to understand the memory resident operating system because it also goes over to leading itself to a repair installation. You have what's known as the recovery disk, right? And the recovery disk allows you to load up an operating system in RAM, and you can run resets. You could do a reset or a restore installation, basically where I can rebuild the failed operating system on the hard drive. Now, keep in mind that the configurations aren't persistent. It gives me access to the hardware. It allows me to work with the computer. But the moment I push power, the moment I shut the device down, the configurations are lost, right? Versus a local installation, right? Keep in mind that the internal drives, they're going to be partitioned. They're going to have active partitions that allow the operating system to bootstrap. However, keep in mind that when you're using your local installations like that, the configurations are persistent. It means that when I make configurations in the operating system, they get applied and stored on the hard drive, in this case in Windows in the registry, and when I restart the machine, guess what? I boot back in and log back into the Windows. Those configurations are going to be there. Now there's goods and there's goods and bads of everything, right? If you look at a corporate environment, you might say, well, wait a second, why wouldn't I want the configurations to be present? Well, or persistent, meaning surviving reboots. Well, I want you to think about a help desk situation. If you give your users the ability to always configure their desktops, it is beneficial in the fact that it gives them consistency and familiarity with the environment that they're working in, but you also have a greater, I guess, tendency to have configuration errors that also survive the reboots. When I have a non-persistent operating system that, let's say we boot to a thin client, we pull the operating system down temporarily, means it gives them the ability to do and work with their productivity software during their workday, but the moment they shut the computer down, we reset those configurations and we could potentially have less configuration errors. So there's good things and bad things, right? All right, so understand memory resident means that it's going to load itself into RAM, and once I shut the power down, it's going to be gone. We do this with recovery disks, repair installations, if you will. We do this with Linux Live CDs, thin clients, all do this as well. But one of your most common installation types is going to be a local installation. I do want to make mention of that because it's something that I know me as an A+ student, I didn't really understand what's going on. Technically, you could say, well, all operating systems run in RAM, but it's the fact that when I turn the power off, that operating system and its configurations, are they still stored in the hard drive? All right, so that leads us into the next concept that I want to move into, and that's something known as the pre-boot execution environment. You might have heard me say the term PXE boot, all right? Well, sometimes we call it PXE because it's PXE, right? PXE, if you will. It's the pre-boot execution environment. Now, what is this? All right, well, the pre-boot execution environment, what it means is that, like most installations, they will start with what's known as a pre-installation environment, right? Windows just calls theirs WinPE. They just call it pre-installation environment. What's a pre-installation environment? It means at this point, the local storage device doesn't have an operating system on it, and at this point, everything's memory resident. But it usually means that you have an operating system that sits in RAM that allows you to install and unpack. Remember the ISO file that we told you had all the parts to the dresser in it? The pre-installation environment's a small, streamlined operating system that allows you to unpack the pieces of the operating system, building the dresser or building the operating system that's going to then be permanently stored on the hard drive. All right, so we want you to know that. Now with PXE boot, I got a little diagram here. What kind of goes on, it's interesting. All right, the network adapter, what it does is it uses this communication by taking in the firmware of the network adapter and communicating with the BIOS, because honestly, it might not even be a network adapter, a card, if you will. It could be just the BIOS that's got that network adapter built into the motherboard, right? It loads up it's essentially a small protocol stack, but you can think of it as a small operating system that then calls out to the network and says, hey, I need an operating system out there. Is there anybody out there with an operating system? And then what happens is we usually have a server out there, and this server will respond back to the Pixie communication. And it'll say, yeah, I hear you out there. Yeah, you're calling for an operating system. I've actually got a boot image that'll let you boot the operating system and start to install it. And it's located right here on my storage device, and it starts to pass it over the network. And then what happens is the boot image, if you will, that first part memory resident operating system loads into RAM. And then from there, communication between the network adapter and the server, you start to unpack essentially the operating system and store it on the local drive. All right, so a very, very good feature to have. In fact, let's go ahead and kind of show you one. I'll show you what Pixie would look like if you were to start this up. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start a Pixie up. And you'll notice here, let me see if okay, so am I going to be able to pause this here real quick? I'm going to go ahead and start this again and see if I can actually suspend this. All right, so let me go ahead and just kind of suspend this right now, just so you guys can see. All right, notice that what we have here is a network boot from Intel, and this is the Intel adapter, right? So what did it do? It calls out to the network and it says, hey, I need an operating system. Do you have one? Here's my MAC address so you can identify who I am. And here's what's known as a globally unique identifier. And the globally unique identifier is just, it's interesting in the fact that MAC addresses today, we used to say, oh, we got so many MAC addresses out there that you'll never have to worry about a duplication. But with virtualization today, that's long since gone. So it actually uses the GUID to uniquely identify itself, because you can see how long this identifier is, right? And then what happens is the server out there, I just happen to be using something known as WDS that we'll get into a little bit more here in a second. The server out there says, oh yeah, I can see you. You need an operating system. Well, I tell you what, you've connected to me, and in this case, if you push F12, I'll go ahead, and what I'm going to do is I will let you, and I'll have to do it one more time because I didn't catch it there. I'll let you go ahead and I'll let you start pulling down the operating system, right? So here's what's going on here in the background. Notice that I have connected to the server, all right? The server gave me an IP address through what we've talked about in other episodes, right? We talked about DHCP. And then it's letting me pull down this boot image. Now the boot image is that pre-installation environment that we were talking about, right? It's going to sit in RAM. I get to make a choice, right? It's going to sit in RAM, and it's going to let me pull down an operating system. Now I didn't make a choice, and this is kind of, there's a timeout because and there you go, you can kind of see it loading that little boot image, right? And what's going on? Well, there we go. Notice that we got an operating system and it's being installed. All right, that is a net boot or a network boot, right? Over the network through Pixie that is now allowing me to do something known as image deployment.
Wes, is this something that's more prevalent nowadays to do it this way, to have these Pixie boot environments so that you can have basically a repository of images that is up in your network storage somewhere?
Most definitely. And Dan, I'm sure you probably ran across it a couple times in the corporate environment, right? Because we were talking about that going from computer to computer to computer. And I do apologize with the matted screen here. I know it's a resolution isn't that great, but you can see that this is actually a deployment, right? This is what's known as image deployment. And I get to interact with the operating system. I can tell it, hey, yeah, I want to use, in this case, I use English, right? And if you speak other languages, if your viewers are in other countries, right, depends on the media that you have, and the same thing with your input method. But Dan, to answer your question here, I had to make sure I interacted with this so it wouldn't time out or select for me. But yeah, to answer your question, that's exactly what I do, right? Because then what happens is, in a network or in a corporate environment where we have, let's say we have 100 computers, right? And Dan says, hey, Wes, I need you as the tech, I need you to put 100 Windows 7 professionals on these 100 machines. But what I need is, I need a little bit more functionality on these 100 machines, and I need you to put Windows 7 Ultimate, or I need you to put Windows 8.1 Pro on there. Well, guess what? Well, where's my installation media? Oh, I got these optical drives. Let me go make a copy of 100. Windows 7 Professional, and let me go make 100 copies of this DVD. It wouldn't work on CDs anyways. Or string out 100 USB devices, and then I'll go sneakernet, right? And go plug them into each machine, loading all the optical drives, and then have to come back through them and push, the one-time boot menu and tell the BIOS to look for those optical drives, right? You can see in a corporate environment that isn't feasible. So just like Dan said, you have a repository of these images, which is essentially these ISO files that we talked about that already have the operating system ready. You pull down a boot menu, right? You pull down a boot image, if you will, like we're doing right here, and essentially you tell it, all right, I want to go ahead and I want to image this machine. So let me go ahead and let me log into our computer here, make sure that I can authenticate.
Well, it's funny, this was the first job I had in tech when I began. This was in 1999, and we used Norton Ghost at the time,
Yes.
Symantec Ghost now. And this is what I did all day. I was imaging machines. We set up a small LAN using a network switch, and we had a server with the images on it, and we did this all day, and then post-configuration, we'd set it out. I worked at the hospital here.
Okay,
in
yeah.
Gainesville. Yeah.
Yeah, and don't let that confuse you, guys. Image deployment is image deployment,
Yeah.
right? It's just the stamp or the brand that's on it. It's
There's
the
many,
same thing.
many different ones out there.
Acronis is another one. Acronis, yeah, exactly.
Altiris,
Yes,
was another one.
Semantic Backup
Yep.
Exec is one. So there's a whole bunch of them, right? We just happen to be showing you Windows deployment services here. It is the same technology, and if you look at the screen here, look at what we got. All right, I've got that's that repository that Dan had mentioned, right? I've got all of these different operating systems that I could pick from, right?
Just basically pointing to a network share.
That's
right?
exactly what it is. That's exactly what it is. It's just a storage location out there on the network, and I could pick one of these operating systems. Let's just pick Windows 7 Ultimate, and I could tell it, yeah, I want to boot to the operating system, right? And you can see that we start to go through a normal install. And I'm going to compare this back to a local install too. So if this is the first time you've seen this, I don't want you to think that it's too highly technical, right? Now, I mean, it does require a little bit of setup. Don't get us wrong. And this is not something that you're going to have to do as far as the network boot side. But I want you guys and gals out there to actually see it. I don't want to just talk about Pixie, right? That's not what we like to do here at IT Pro TV. We want to also show you what it looks like. So now we're going through a basic installation. All right, and I could do some formatting if I wanted as well, and my head's kind of covering it up here. There we go. And we see the next option, and I go through, and then it says wait for the server, right? And if I've got it configured right, and hopefully I do, I got it configured right on the server, what we're going to see is that it's going to start the installation. Now, understand that this is still a hands-on process, right? This is still, again, you know, I gave the example of 100 computers here or there, right? There is a way that we can go a little bit farther than this, right? We can do what's known as an unattended installation, all right? Now, you do not have to understand how to configure some of these technologies that we're showing you. We just don't want to sit here and talk about them and not give you something tangible to see. All right, with an unintended installation, notice how I had to pick some things. Notice how I had to log in. I had to select an operating system. That's great. That's a great thing for a remote installation. But wouldn't you like a way that you can say, I know these 100 computers, I know what they need, I know what operating system they need, and I just want them to reach out to that server the moment they boot up and pull down that operating system. And then when it comes to the post configurations that we're going to show you how to do here, probably in a part 2, right? I don't have to sit here and do the hands-on. I can let the computer do it. I can let the server and the communication between the Pixie boot and the deployment server say, oh, those are the settings that need to apply to this machine, right? And what do we do? How do we do that? Well, with an unintended installation, all you're really doing is saying, you know what, operating system? When you go to install, I also want you to pull down this file. In Windows, we call it a answer file. And instead of you stopping and waiting for a dialog box with human interaction, it says, oh, you need the English language or French or Spanish, depending on what country you might be in, and you need the English keyboard layout, the United States keyboard layout, or you need the United States International keyboard layout, and it answers those dialog boxes, hence why they call it an answer file. And it makes it completely automated. And now when Dan says, hey, Wes, I need you to go ahead and install those operating systems, 100 on this machine, 100 on these machines, and I need these settings, I need them joined to the corporate network, I need them joined to the corporate network over here, I can schedule it, all right? And I can tell this server that's handing out the images, when 100 of these computers connect, pull down this file and apply all those settings. And we do what's known as a zero-touch deployment, right? It's called a ZTI, zero-touch installation. This is what's known as an LTI, a light-touch installation. It means I still got to get a little bit interactive, right? So it's a great thing to have, but you know what? Unfortunately, like again, I've only scratched the surface, and I'm looking at my notes, and we still got a few pages to go.
Yeah, we got a little more info to cover for you good folks out there, and a lot of little time to do it. Yeah, we're out of time for this episode, so we will have to move into a part 2, maybe even a part 3. Who knows? A part 4 could be on the horizons. You never know with this crazy kook over here. He can yammer on all day about some really fun and exciting stuff, though. So definitely come back for that. Wes, we thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely.
Looking forward to seeing you in the next episode as well. It is time for us to sign off for IT Pro TV. I've been your host, Daniel Lowry.
And I'm Wes Bryan.
And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.